very, very complicated, very confusing, very often trying to find a needle in a haystack, right? That type of thing. So, getting back to my point, there are many people all over the world that believe they're Jewish, though, but they have nada, zilch, nothing as evidence. We're kind of going to get into that. And if you're one of those folks like I was, help you come to hopefully a positive conclusion that you're looking for, if you're looking for that, into what your ancestry may be. So what are the reasons that this DNA information and DNA tests about Jewishness, and let me restate that point and underscore it. So very often when, and I find this in my own DNA cousin pool, where I have quite a few Jewish cousins that range, again, all the way from maybe 1-2%. Many have 7 to 10%, but I have actually several that are 100% Ashkenazi European Jewish. Just a few that are Sephardic Jewish, but that's on a different test. Because what I'm referring to right now when I say my pool is my Ancestry.com DNA genetic cousin pool. I hope that makes sense. All right. And let me say that I'm not being paid by Ancestry.com. I don't receive a dime from them. Maybe one day I will. But for now, I'm just bringing them up because they have been the most helpful in my DNA search. All right. Now, they charge a fair amount for a monthly subscription so you can have access just to be able to see these cousin DNA trees and so on. I don't think they should do that, but that's just my opinion. Every company has to make money, but charging $300-400 a year just so I can have access to this information seems a little robbery to me. Just my opinion. But they do provide a great service. I want to say that. And I could not, let me understate that or restate that. I could not possibly have found my Jewish ancestry without the help of Ancestry.com. So I do owe them a debt of gratitude. All right. But what is the number one reason, generally speaking, that these ancestry or DNA tests and so on given by these companies I've mentioned, and let me rename them, Ancestry.com, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, and MyHeritage DNA. Those are probably, roughly in my experience, the four main, best, most useful DNA sites. But the reason that it's difficult to be completely clear about a person's actual DNA makeup from these tests is that, again, they're all testing from kind of different points of reference. They all actually have different goals about where they're sort of taking you and steering you from an ancestry standpoint. Again, Ancestry.com is just about that. That's why that's their name, right? If you want to find what is your ancestry, whether it's Jewish or German or Indian or whatever it is, right? Because they give you such a wide range of DNA cousins that you can look at and compare their DNA, right? You can also compare their family tree. You can also compare places they've been. It's super, super helpful. In fact, the number, I'll probably state this again later, but the number of cousins I get from Ancestry.com is in the neighborhood of 30,000 versus 23andMe, which, as I mentioned, is really more about health. They're helping you to use your genetics and your DNA to find out if there are challenges, issues, problems, so on, back in your ancestry, which can indicate health challenges, which you can hopefully get ahead of and correct. So useful, but not so useful for this purpose, because I have 1,500 DNA cousins on 23andMe, as I pointed out. Now, some of those cousins can be very, very important. As I pointed out, my cousin Cohen, my female cousin Cohen in England was actually super helpful in both clearing up some things and motivating me to sort of keep going, because this can be a very discouraging area and topic of study. Therefore, every time you find a new step, a new clue, make an ancestral leap, it's very encouraging and sort of keeps you going. And everyone, and all of you listening that are maybe exploring your Jewish ancestry, will find places where you get stuck. It's inevitable. And so, again, having encouraging finds as you go through this process can be very, very, very helpful. Okay. Family tree DNA. They're actually supposed to be, they're a Jewish company, and actually are supposed to be the experts in Jewish DNA. But in that test, I don't know, maybe I have 500 cousins at best that I'm working with that I can compare. And I get very little information about those cousins, right, and their trees. So I just haven't personally found it to be super, super helpful for this purpose. And then there's, lastly, my heritage DNA. And my heritage DNA can be very helpful. And the reason for that is that it has a little bit more of a Europe-centric client base. In other words, I'll have many more ancestors or DNA cousins that are still living in Europe, still living in France, still living in Spain, still living in Germany, I'm actually going down the list on purpose, still living in the Netherlands, still living in Finland, still living in Russia. And so, again, I'm a African-American who grew up in the United States without any of this knowledge. And in fact, although my skin's relatively light, so I had some clue, I had no idea that I had DNA cousins. And some of them are not that far off. I mean, we're talking fourth cousins here, right? That are still living in Russia to this day. And names completely Russian. I don't even think they speak English. So that's a pretty shocking revelation. And as you know, since many Jews came from Russia, that's a pretty good indication of, again, finding a clue that can be very helpful and very enlightening in terms of going down this Jewish path. So again, each DNA test comes up with a slightly different result, which can be critical. And although, again, I'm not an expert genealogist, and in fact, not a genealogist at all, and certainly not an expert in the field of DNA ancestry research, from my studies these topics, I have determined that at least part of the reason for this is that each company, again, utilizes a different DNA results pool. And foundationally, that pool, in order to come to some conclusion, is going in a different direction, right? So, in other words, if I take all of these DNA pools, samples that these companies use, and I try to make a clear determination based on just one, I may be completely off. And that is the result of what I see in my own tests. Some tests, or I should say the Ancestry.com test, will show that, in fact, I have 20% what they would refer to as Iberian DNA. Or roughly said, my ancestors came from that area, basically 20% of my ancestry tree. Okay. Then it will point to England and Africa and other locations, of course, that will be much larger, much stronger. But again, since we're looking for a small trail, that 20% can be very useful. Now, switching gears over to 23andMe, it may show a slight indication, maybe 10% of Iberian ancestry. Family Tree, on the other hand, shows 0. So if I only trusted Family Tree DNA and I said, well, that's it, this test says I don't have anything to indicate any Sephardic ancestry, Spanish ancestry, Portuguese ancestry whatsoever, and there's no actual family members, this is the case with family tree DNA, that come from Portugal or Spain, I should probably give up, right? But I'm here to tell you that you should keep going. I'm not encouraging you to spend a ton of money on this necessarily. It's up to you. But if you want to do yourself a favor, and if you want to try to be as reasonably exhaustive as you can with using these types of tests to help you to find your Jewish ancestry, I'm going to recommend these three in this order: Ancestry.com, MyHeritage DNA, and then 23andMe. Now, back to these tests and what they're kind of getting at, right? So, in my opinion, these tests are really pointing more to what locations around the earth your ancestors recently, I'll use the rough term, hung out in, lived in, spent time in, right? Because, again, if your ancestors lived in England for the last 200 years, that doesn't mean they're English. They may not be English at all. And this is often the case. If they came from a different country, even one as close as France, and they only intermarried with people of French descent, then they're actually French. But the tests will tell you that they're from England. It will give you records about England. And you'll not in some cases, you will not be able to go as far back enough as you need to go to. Let's say from the 1700s back to the 1500s. Your ancestors were in France in the 1500s. Then they moved to England in the 1700s. And you don't have enough records and research to get you back to France. This part may be invisible for you. So let's add to the top of that. Suppose these are Jewish people living in France who moved to England, who moved to the United States. You can see it can be very, very confusing. And these tests are not meant to, not structured to really reveal this level of detail of information. So if you've taken one of these ancestry-based DNA tests, or go and take one, you may often find, again, as in my case, that a lot of indicators of what may be Jewish ancestry or other ancestry are being completely missed. So let me say, again, this can be very confusing, discouraging, and time-consuming for the average non-expert person hoping to trace Jewish DNA or Jewish roots. Again, it's buried in many years and many generations of ancestral trees. All right, so what to do about it? How do we move ahead? So again, let me underscore, in my pretty reasonably educated and experienced opinion, the best place to spend most of your time and money, whether you're an ancestry research beginner or someone that's been at this for some time, is to go and purchase an Ancestry.com DNA kit, then sign up for their monthly service, which allows you access to the most important item in the Ancestry DNA.com portfolio of services and so on. And again, that is access to as many as, in my case, 30,000 DNA cousins and their ancestry trees, as well as all the research that they have put into their trees and their families. And then, of course, you can also, which I often do, message and speak with your ancestry DNA cousins. They make that pretty easy as part of the service, and they can clear up any questions you have, and you will. And if they're fairly close cousins, as some of mine are, you can actually get pictures and so forth that can be shared. Some of those pictures are 200 years old, so that can be, again, very, very helpful. Now, let me use a couple of examples of what I've been talking about from one of my favorite television shows that I mentioned. And if you watch this show, you will find that there are numerous examples of, again, very famous people that can be cited that are dealing with the same situation that we're talking about, right? Very often, some of these folks will contact Dr. Henry Louis Gates, who is the host of the PBS show, Finding Your Roots, and they will ask him to help them to find their roots or answer some question that they have questions about. I'm sure there's lots of other things like publicity and so on to go into that, but at least for the show's purposes, again, it's interesting and helpful for the subject that we're on. Now, in my first example, or my first two examples, I should say, we have two famous gentlemen that we're focused on. In fact, three. The first is the very well-known TV show host, Bryant Gumbel. And you could also, when I say three, include, by default, his also very well-known sportscasting brother, Greg Gumbel, which is on I think it's the NFL Today. And the other less well-known, but very popular author-creator he is the author and creator of the very popular HBO series, Game of Thrones. His name is George R.R. Martin. Now, in Martin's case, he's as Jewish-looking, in my opinion, European Jewish-looking person and sounding person, Jewish man, as I've ever seen. In fact, as soon as I saw him, I went, well, this is a Jewish man, right? But in fact, he had no idea of any Jewishness whatsoever in his family, which we're going to get to. And to me, again, coming back to his looks, and you can look him up on Google him on the internet and so on, he looks like he came straight out of one of the most famous Jewish movies of all times, Fiddler on the Roof. He even had the same hat or similar hat. So that was interesting to me, right? How can you look this way, sound this way, wear this kind of almost Jewish sort of attire, and then not have any idea that you're Jewish? But it happens. It happens, right? This is what's happened, especially in the United States, in parts of Europe, with the different mixings of different types of people into the melting pots that we have today. This is the outcome. Now, as Henry Louis Gates, or Dr. Gates, as we refer to him for short, usually reveals on his show, in this case, both men have reasonably, substantially, in my case, I call it substantial for our purposes, and clear Jewish ancestry, no doubt whatsoever. And not so long ago, going back in history, really only 3-4 generations. That's not so long ago. Okay? Now, the common quote that all of Dr. Gates' guests, and these two guests are no different, in particular, their quote you'll always hear them say is, "I had no idea." And again, that's beyond just Jewish ancestry. That's all kinds of things in their family, Italian ancestry, and so on. And I kind of paraphrase that, but that's the basic quote. I had no idea. Even though both of these men we're referring to, Gumbel and Martin, they're rich, they're famous, very intelligent, yet this simple ancestral fact of Jewishness escapes them. It's not like they don't want to know about it. It's just that for the common person, digging and finding this information, again, can be complex and difficult. Even if you hire a genealogist, they may not find what we're talking about here, right? It all depends on what their skill level is, what tests they're using, what tools they're using, and what they're looking for. Very often, if you tell them you're Italian American, that's kind of the path they're going on. Certainly, if you tell them that you're African American, or they can see you're African American, they're sticking mainly with that path, right? So sometimes it's really better to, if you don't have someone like Dr. Gates, and most of us don't, because I'm sure he spends quite a few dollars in researching these celebrities and their ancestral trees, and going over to Europe and other places to find their roots, right? If you don't have that, it's best that you spend some time, if it's of interest to you, to go back on your own again, right? So, and in some cases, even these rich folks celebrities and so on, may have actually taken some time and investigated their ancestry themselves. And still, even them, and this is often brought up on the show, they had found no evidence or not enough evidence to make the case that maybe Dr. Gates is making. So back to our two friends, Mr. Gumbel and Mr. Martin. Our host, Dr. Gates, was able in a fairly short amount of time to reveal, again, that both men were of so-called European or Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. In the case of Gumbel, whose family line through his father, or paternal line, originated from a U.S. standpoint in the New Orleans, Louisiana area, which is a very, very common area for Jews immigrating to the U.S., especially in the pre-Civil War era. And as Dr. Gates has, again, a very extensive staff to dig into these things, all kinds of records, courts, and so on and so forth, hospitals, and so on and so forth, he was able to point out and reveal that Gumbel's surname comes from a German Jewish community by way of his second great-grandfather, okay? So think back in your world, right? How far back is your second great-grandfather? Not so long ago.